Hey, yo, Lester here, babe. You come at the king, you best not miss.
All right, folks. This is the last one for Ulysses. This is the last free one for Ulysses. I'm going to say this. I wish you guys would actually do more intense research. Okay? Really do more intense research. Now, well before 2003, which is the article that Ulysses listed, in 2001, right after 9/11, possibly, I do believe it was right around December. It might have been a little later than that. It might have been 2002 when they first announced they were going after Afghanistan, well before they really talked about Iraq. They were talking about Afghanistan and the axis of evil with Afghanistan, Iraq, and Iran. Well, Afghanistan, Iran, and then Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, and then the North Korea. And even back then, the rumor is that Iran was actually the target and not Iraq. Syria was not in the picture at all. If you look at the map, the easiest way and the best way to get a pipeline into Turkey and into Europe is not through Syria. It was actually through Iraq, which is a much, much bigger country and has more territory, and is actually under the United States control, which actually makes more sense. Now, that's just looking at the map. Now, since he gave me two articles, I can't even remember what they were, but he posted two articles. And so I just, Google is your friend. So basically, I just punched in Syrian pipeline. Guess what came up? First, actually three came up, but I'm going to read two. One from Truthout and one from an analyst that's in Beirut, that's actually in the region, that talks about the pipeline or the proposed Qatari pipeline that's being floated by Robert Kennedy Jr. There was now these two articles actually go back and through the record and actually disprove that theory, which I always thought was, which was never announced as the reason for going after Syria in the first place. And doesn't make sense to fight a whole war, destroy a country over a pipeline when you could have just routed the pipeline through a country they had already destroyed, which is Iraq, which could be had for a lot cheaper and who the United States already controls. But I'm going to read these two articles in the record, and I'm going to be back on the other side. This is from 2016. The war against the Assad regime is not a pipeline war. This is from Gareth Porter from Truthout. The reason put forth by the Obama administration for the war against Bashar al-Assad regime, saving the Syrian people from suffering and death at the hands of Assad, has no credibility with anyone familiar with the record of the U.S. interventions for the regime change around the world. As has been the case with all other wars the U.S. has fought over the decades, opponents of the U.S. war state have had to come up with their own explanations for the sponsorship of a sectarian bloodbath in Syria. The explanation that is rapidly gaining popularity is that the war in Syria is a pipeline war, fought to ensure that the natural gas from Qatar would go to Europe through Syria and would weaken Europe's dependence on Russia for its energy. That argument has been made a number of places over the past few years, but the most widely republished version is an essay by Robert F. Kennedy Jr. in Politico, arguing that the Obama administration began to lay the groundwork for overwhelming the Assad regime in 2009 after Syrian President Bashar al-Assad rejected a pipeline proposed by Qatar. That planned pipeline, agreed to by Qatar and Turkey, Kennedy argues, would have linked Qatar's natural gas to European markets through the Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Syria, and Turkey. So it would have deprived Russia of Europe's dependence on its natural gas. But Assad not only prevented the realization of the Qatari plan, but signed up with Iran for an alternative pipeline that would make Iran, not Qatar, the principal Middle East supplier of natural gas to European energy markets, according to the Pipeline War account. So the Obama administration decided that Assad had to be removed from power. It's easy to understand why that explanation would be accepted by many anti-war activists. It is in line with the widely accepted theory that the U.S. wars in the Middle East have all been oil wars, but getting control of the petroleum resources of the region and denying them to America's enemies. But the pipeline war theory is based on false history, and it represents a distraction from the real problem of U.S. policy in the Middle East. The U.S. war state's determination to hold on to its military posture in the region. It is true that Qatar had proposed a pipeline to carry its natural gas to Turkey, but nearly everything else about the story turns out, upon investigation, to be untrue. There is no contemporaneous report of any such rejection by the Syrian government. It was only 4 years later, in August 2013, that the agency France Press article recounting what had happened in a meeting between President Vladimir Putin and Saudi intelligence chief Prince Bandar bin Sultan claimed in passing, in 2009, Assad refused to sign an agreement with Qatar for an overland pipeline running from the Gulf to Europe via Syria to protect the interests of its Russian ally, which is Europe's top supplier of natural gas. No source is given for the statement, but the main source for other information in the article was a European diplomat who shuttles between Beirut and Damascus. That claim has no credibility for a very simple reason. There was no Qatari proposal for Syria to reject in 2009. It was not until October 2009 that Qatar and Turkey even agreed to form a working group to develop such a gas pipeline project. Even more important, the immediate problem for Qatar's proposal was not Syria, but Saudi Arabia, whose territory the Qatari gas would have to cross to get to Syria. In January 2010, The National, a daily UAE newspaper, reported that the main obstacle to the idea of a pipeline to carry Qatari natural gas to Turkey and then to Europe was said to be Saudi Arabia, which has a track record of obstructing regional pipeline development and still had a very bad relations with Qatar. And Middle East geopolitical analyst Felix Imonti reported at oilprice.com in 2012 that Qatar had been forced to abandon the pipeline idea in 2010 because Saudi Arabia had not agreed to have it built across its territory. So where did this idea that the Obama administration responded to Assad's alleged rejection by shifting to covert regime change policy come from? Kennedy's article asserts. In 2009, according to WikiLeaks, soon after Bashar Assad rejected the Qatar pipeline, the CIA began funding opposition groups in Syria. But the article links to a Washington Post news report on the WikiLeaks cables on Syria that doesn't support the charge at all. According to the Post report, the cables show that a London-based satellite channel called Barata TV, supported by the State Department, began broadcasting in April 2009. But they also show, according to the Post report, that the State Department had funneled as much as $6 billion to the group since 2006 to operate the satellite channel and finance other activities inside Syria. So the U.S. funding for opposition groups in Syria aimed at exploiting the regime's vulnerabilities had begun under the Bush administration years before any supposed Syrian rejection of the Qatari pipeline proposal. The WikiLeaks documents thus contradict the alleged connection between the pipeline deal and a change in U.S. policy towards Syria. Moreover, despite the reference to Saudi and Israeli intelligence reports that WikiLeaks has obtained, no story has been published based on those leaked documents that supports the pipeline war thesis. Furthermore, the pipeline theory ignores the fact that the proposed Qatari to Turkey pipeline was always contingent on being able to link up with a larger proposed pipeline, the so-called Nabucco pipeline going through Turkey that was designed by the EU to reduce European dependence on Russian gas. But as The Guardian reported in July 2009, the Nabucco pipeline project has been mired in disputes and difficulties for 2 years, raising doubts about its viability. For one thing, it was never clear where the supply of gas would come from. But what reduced its prospects even further was the fact that the European financial and economic slowdown of 2008 and 9 had caused natural gas prices to decline for the first time ever, and that there was no upturn in sight by mid-2010. The gas prices in Central and Eastern Europe, the intended market for the gas, were significantly lower than those in Italy and Greece, which were the target markets for a competing pipeline plan. That caused potential sources of finance to back away from the Nabucco project. The Shah Deniz Consortium, which represented the suppliers of gas from Azerbaijan's Shah Deniz gas field, was to make the ultimate decision on which plan for the pipeline from the Middle East to Europe would be chosen. And at a Black Sea Energy Conference in Istanbul in mid-November 2011, the Azeri Gas Consortium announced that this gas will be transported to Italy and Greece using a much shorter pipeline than had been envisioned by the Nabucco proposal. So, long before Turkey, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, with the assistance of the CIA, began shipping weapons to anti-regime armed groups in Syria in late 2011, the Obama administration could not have been thinking of a regime change in Syria to save a Syria-Turkey pipeline for Qatari gas. They all knew perfectly well that there was no longer any possibility of such a Qatar to Turkey pipeline. If it's not a pipeline war, why is the U.S. intervening in Syria? The U.S. decision to support Turkey, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia in their ill-conceived plan to overthrow the Assad regime was primarily a function of the primordial interest of the United States' permanent war state in its regional alliances. The three Sunni allies control U.S. access to the key U.S. military bases in the region, and the Pentagon, the CIA, the State Department, and the Obama White House were all concerned above all with protecting the existing arrangements for the U.S. military posture in the region. After all, those military bases are what allow the United States to play at the role of hegemonic power in the Middle East. Despite the disasters that have accompanied that role, the degree to which the U.S. determination to preserve its military profile in the region is illustrated by the case of U.S.-Qatar relations over that tiny monarch's arming of extremist Sunni groups in Syria in 2012. The Obama administration was very unhappy with Qatar's choice of proxies in Syria. And the National Security Council discussed a proposal to pull a squadron of U.S. fighter planes from Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar as a way of putting pressure on the government over the issue, according to the story in the Wall Street Journal. But the U.S. Central Command, CENTCOM, which had moved its headquarters to Al Udeid in 2003, argued that the base was critical to its operations in the region and that it was about to renegotiate its agreement with Qatar over the use of it. The Pentagon supported CENTCOM's opposition to any move that would disturb relations with Qatar over the issue and vetoed any such pressure on Qatar. The administration ended up doing nothing about the issue, and in 2013, the U.S.-Qatar Defense Corporation agreement, originally reached in 2003, was renewed for another 10 years. The massive direct and immediate power interests of the U.S. war state, not the determination to ensure that a pipeline would carry Qatar's natural gas to Europe, drove the U.S. policy of participation in the war against the Syrian regime. Only if activists focus on the reality will they be able to unite effectively to oppose not only the Syrian adventure, but the war system itself. Truthout exists to sift fact from fiction, rhetoric from reality. This is from Truthout 2016. This is from Paul Cochran, Beirut journalist. The Pipelineistan conspiracy. The war in Syria has never been about gas. This is from May 2017. The pipeline hypothesis do not stand up to the realities of how energy is transported through the Middle East in the 21st century. 6 years ago, into a conflict that has killed at least 400,000 people, there is a widely held belief that the bloodshed in Syria is simply another war over Middle Eastern energy resources. The bloodshed, so the theory goes, is a proxy battle about two proposed pipelines which would run across the country and on to Turkey and Europe. While neither pipeline has left the drawing board or indeed ever was realistic, this has not dampened the theory's popularity as a core reason for the Syria conflict. The first pipeline is allegedly backed by the U.S. and runs from Qatar through Saudi Arabia and Jordan to Syria. The second is supposedly a Russian-backed pipeline that goes from Iran via Iraq to Syria. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad is claimed to have rejected the Qatari pipeline in 2009 at the request of Moscow to ensure that European reliance on Russian gas would not be undermined. As a result, some commentators claim that the U.S. and its European and Gulf allies, including Qatar, decided to orchestrate a rebellion against Assad to ensure that their pipeline dreams became a reality rather than the Iranian option. Russia, in turn, backed Syria to ensure its own energy interests prevailed. Iran is also an ally of the current regime in Damascus. These claims have been promoted in several quarters. The Qatari-based Al Jazeera first floated the concept of Pipelineistan in 2012. Even U.S. establishment journal Foreign Affairs and Guardian newspaper picked up the theory, which gained further traction in 2016 in an article by Robert Kennedy Jr. and was flagged by, among others, Jill Stein of the Green Party, a former U.S. presidential candidate. The idea was floated again after the U.S. bombing of Syria in April. It was claimed, it was further proof of Washington's desire to oust Assad and enable Europe to diversify its gas dependency away from Russia. While the U.S. has been covertly working with Gulf allies against the Assad regime controlling Syria's energy resources, and pipeline network was not a primary concern. If so, it would be a very low priority for regime change. Why? Firstly, the timeline is wrong. Covert action against Syria started under the George W. Bush administration in 2005, well before the alleged Qatari offer to Damascus in 2009. We can see U.S. action against the Syrian regime well before the notion of this pipeline came into existence, says Justin Dargan, an energy scholar at Oxford University. Secondly, the pipeline hypothesis does not stand up to the realities of how energy is transported through the Middle East and the obstacles faced by pipeline proposals, many of which failed to come to fruition. Even the Arab gas pipeline, whose second phase came online in 2005, has been mired in problems. Robin Yassin Kassab, author of Burning Country, Syrians in Revolution and War, says the Pipelineistan theory ignores how the conflict started in the early months of the revolution. Like all conspiracies, it thrives on the absence of content and in-depth knowledge of the country, he says. 1. Domestic demand. In 2009, Syria announced a policy that attracted minimal attention beyond its borders at the time, called the Four Seas Strategy. It aimed to turn the country into a transit hub for gas between the Gulf, the Black Sea, the Caucasus, and the Mediterranean by expanding the 6,300 kilometers of gas and oil pipelines that crisscross the country, and by making use of the Euro-Arab Mashreq gas pipeline. The AGP is not a core feature in the Pipelineistan narrative, but it does indicate the problems faced when it comes to laying down pipelines in the region. On the drawing board for nearly 20 years, construction of the AGP started in 2003. It was slated to cost $1.2 billion and run 1,200 kilometers from Egypt to Jordan and Syria before reaching Turkey. There it would connect with the planned Nabucco pipeline, which would export gas to Europe. The key element of the AGP plan was that Egypt would pump gas to Syria and Jordan. Syria would use the Egyptian gas and then top up the pipeline with gas from its own northern fields before it's sent on to the north. When the war broke out in Syria in 2011, the last leg of the AGP, the stretch from Aleppo to Kilis in Turkey, was being constructed, never to be completed. But there were problems with the pipeline, which cost $1.5 million per kilometer, even before the conflict erupted. Jim Deakins, a Scottish energy consultant who worked on the AGP in Syria, including designing the final phase of the project. When I left Damascus in 2010, there wasn't enough gas being fed up through Jordan. The Egyptians were gas trapped. They didn't have enough gas to export, despite signing contracts left and right and center, so they couldn't meet their obligations. Egypt's gas production dropped from 220 million cubic feet per day in 2010 to 80 million cubic feet in 2011. The AGP was shut down by 2012 after terrorist attacks on the pipeline in the Sinai, and Egypt's increasing need for gas for home consumption has not resumed operations. Without enough gas, the AGP became a white elephant. Effectively, the whole project was about exporting gas from Egypt to Europe. But in reality, there was never going to be enough for it to be reasonably worthwhile. The same issues that plagued the AGP would also apply to any planned Iranian pipeline to Syria, namely lack of gas. Iran has been attempting to develop its Pars field in the Persian Gulf for a long time, says Dargan. But there are big obstacles, not least with Iran, where there are competing theories on which development plans would have priority. One idea is for gas to be used domestically, as they've quite a lot of issues meeting their own needs. Indeed, Iran could not meet its own gas needs before an agreement was even signed in Damascus in 2011. Deakin explains the whole point is that while Syria was actively talking about gas from Iran, Tehran, and importing gas from Azerbaijan during the winter months, that really blows the theory of a gas grab out of the window. Iran was supply gas to Syria was complete nonsense, and I told the Syrian energy minister that at the time. A missing jigsaw piece. The AGP's viability beyond Syria was also dependent on Nabucco, another pipeline proposal intended to diversify Europe's gas imports. That idea, floated by a consortium of European and Turkish energy companies in 2002, was slated to cost more than $10 billion. The project would pipe 31 billion cubic meters of natural gas a year from some 3,000 kilometers from Central Asia via Turkey to Baumgarten in Austria. But by 2009, Nabucco had still not started, and projected construction costs ballooned to more than $25 billion. 8 years later, Nabucco has still not progressed due to the extraordinary cost and the politics at play. Dargan says at energy conferences, Nabucco is still brought up, but it's like, where's Waldo? It is phenomenal. The Nabucco pipeline would be essential for both of the contending pipelines, which would need to piggyback off of it if they want gas to reach Europe. But while Russia was opposed to Nabucco and the idea of Qatari pipeline, it was not enough of a reason for conflict, says Dargan. You have a motive, a victim, but not a murder weapon. There is no evidence. Furthermore, Russia had managed to axe Nabucco in 2007 by announcing its South Stream pipeline project, which was to cut out Turkey altogether by crossing the Black Sea to Bulgaria onto Europe. The project was canceled in 2014 according to political issues with the European Union. Moscow proposed the Turk Stream project in 2014, which was again to cut across the Black Sea, but then onto the European side of Turkey. It was canceled after a Russian jet fighter was shot down by Turkey in 2015. While both projects are back on the cards, especially Turk Stream, neither could transport Iranian or Qatari oil across Turkey. 3. No Qatari offer to Damascus. The pipeline narrative from 2013 onwards also makes mention of Damascus rebuffing an alleged Qatari offer in 2009 to build a pipeline. This part of the story hinges around statements by an unnamed diplomat in a 2013 Agence France Press article about a meeting between Russia's Vladimir Putin and Saudi Arabia's Bandar bin Sultan. The report says in 2009, Assad refused to sign an agreement in Qatar for the overland pipeline running from the Gulf via Syria to protect the interests of his Russian ally, which is Europe's top supplier of natural gas. But Dargan says there is no credible sources that show that Qatar even approached Syria in 2009 and rebuffed it in the process. I am not saying it definitely did not occur, but rather there is no evidence supporting this claim. Syrian experts also support Dargan's rebuttal, highlighting that the burgeoning economic and political ties between Doha and Damascus. Yassin says the absurdity is that relations between the Assad regime and the Qataris were excellent until 2011. Assad and his wife and the Qatari royal couple were also being portrayed as personal friends. Although Assad may have repeatedly criticized Qatar in late 2011 onwards for supporting terrorists, he has never publicly stated that Qatari support for the rebels was over a future pipeline. Jihad Zaghi, editor of economy website Syria Report, says an important aspect that we don't talk about is the Syrian government never said the Qataris were fighting for a pipeline. It is telling in itself that Assad never mentioned it. The Moscow-Tehran connection. There is the other part of the Pipelineistan puzzle, that the Iran-Syria pipeline known as the Islamic pipeline. As Ziggy explains, the Islamic pipeline that has been talked about for years. There were pre-contract memorandums of understanding, but until 2011, there was no formal signing between Syria and Iran. You can't argue this is a serious reason to destroy a whole country. While the project was politically expedient, it ignored economic and energy realities. First, the project was estimated to cost $10 billion, but it was unclear who would foot the bill, particularly as Tehran was and still is under U.S. and international sanction, as is Syria since 2011. Second, Iran lacks the capabilities to export significant amounts of gas. Sanctions mean it cannot access the advanced U.S. technology that would allow it to exploit gas from the South Pars field that borders Qatar. Russia would force Damascus to veto a Qatari pipeline in favor of an Iranian one. Also ignores another reality, that Moscow and Tehran are potential energy rivals. Competition for gas access in the region is not between Qatar and Iran, but between Russia and Iran, says Ziggy. The ones with the biggest share of the European market are the Russians, and they want to secure that. They are the ones to fear the Iranians. Despite talk of how pipeline wars would enable Europe to diversify away from Russian gas exports to Europe hit a record high in January 2017. In December 2016, commodities trader Glencore and the Qatari Investment Authority The country's sovereign wealth fund acquired 19.5% stake of Rosneft, Russian state-owned oil company, for $11 billion. Result: Qatar has achieved easier access to the European market than any pipeline through Syria ever could offer. Politics makes plan a pipe dream. The Iranian pipeline would have to cross Iraq. Aside from the problems of building infrastructure in a conflict zone, plans to pipe gas just a short distance from Iraq to Syria were not viable even in 2009. Deacon says that the Iraqis were observers of the AGP project and that he also discussed bringing gas from Iraq over the Euphrates with the EU ambassador to Iraq. But it got bogged down in politics, said the Iraqi infrastructure was so badly maintained and destroyed that they would have to rebuild, not just fix it. The infrastructure investment was needed before even bringing in pipelines. Likewise, politics would also impact any Qatari plans. Dargan explains such a pipeline would have had to pass through Saudi territory, which perhaps would have been an even larger obstacle than Syria, as Riyadh has blocked and obstructed numerous proposals for regional pipelines. Indeed, Saudi obstruction caused planners in the mid-2000s to redraw routes for the Dolphin pipeline, which pipes gas from Qatar to the UAE. All three are members of the Gulf Cooperation Council. Saudi Arabia placed numerous hurdles in the undersea passage of the Dolphin pipeline as it would pass through its maritime boundaries, says Dargan. Saudi opposition was the principal reason we do not see a Qatari pipeline to Bahrain or Kuwait. Indeed, Saudi opposition to Qatari gas pipelines has been so strong that the Doha has switched its strategy from dry gas pipelines to liquefied natural gas instead. As a result, Doha has become the world's largest LNG exporter during the past 15 years. It has invested more than $11 billion on LNG cargo shipping fleet that is independent of any fixed pipeline infrastructure and can take LNG anywhere. The vast and growing gas markets are in Asia, especially Japan, China, South Korea, and India. LNG is also a more competitive option than piping dry gas to Europe, where gas demand is flat and forecast depressed compared to Asia and within the Middle East itself. Nasser Tamimi, an independent Qatari energy expert, says, with the existing infrastructure, Qatar doesn't have enough gas to sell to Europe through a pipeline, as most contracts currently are to Asia and long term, while demand within Qatar is rising. A pipeline has to be economically justifiable and secure demand from buyers in the long term to recover pipeline costs. Maintaining the pipeline and paying transit fees to the host country is the most optimistic scenario, would cost between $7 and $9 per British thermal unit to reach Europe. LNG is cheaper, even with the most expensive scenario is $5 to $5.50 per BTU. Such factors all coalesce to make the Qatari and Iranian suggestions nigh impossible. As Tamimi explains, if Syria and Iraq stabilize and political relations with Saudi and Iraq improve after all of that, then you can think of a pipeline. But at the end of the day, it's a pipeline dream. Now, all this to say what? At the end of the day, just like any other theory over there, it's a smokescreen. The petrodollar is a real thing, but sometimes we give it way too much credence. I believe in action-reaction. A lot of you guys are actually going over the same theories that we went through way back in 2001, 2003. In fact, going all the way back to 1990 with the first Iraq war. You guys are still rehashing the same theories about the petrodollar. The petrodollar is a real thing, but the petrodollar or the dollar system is actually more complex than just oil. I always suggest the book Gold, Dollars, and Power, which nobody reads, but they poo-poo it. There's a reason that Dr. Gavin, got a seat at the Council of Foreign Relations and actually got hidden because it talks about the dollar system and how it's constructed. But nobody reads it. Nobody's interested in it because you want to believe the talking points that they have been talking about for the last 30 years. It's more complex than that. There's more to it than that. And basically the petrodollar, as far as the Middle East, is not a thing. As you can see, the Qataris actually built an LNG plant or LNG system that was actually cheaper than it would be to build a pipeline. Transporting dry gas with the associated fees is actually more money. It's easier and cheaper and less headache than it is to actually build the LNG port, which you have seen the picture of, and transport it any place in the world. And as I said before, the biggest users of the oil and gas now is Asia and not the West. In fact, Europe and the West are trying to go off of fossil fuels by going to solar. So trying to keep Europe and everybody else captive because of oil and gas is a losing proposition. China is the biggest user of oil now. And the United States cannot threaten the whole world not to sell oil to China. It's not possible anymore. So what is it that the United States is trying to do? I'm not going to repeat it here. I've said it too many times, so I'm blue in the face. The United States is trying to keep its hegemony, which is why I played Mearsheimer's video before this one. It's never been about oil. It's about hegemony. And for you, Ulysses, as in particular, look up Mackinder, 1904. The balance of power that Britain played back in the 19th and 20th century. It's basically what the United States is trying to do on a global scale between Russia, China, and themselves. But since you're not into geopolitics because you're coming at the king and you think that you're equal, you never heard of Mackinder. You probably never even looked at the chessboard. I know you've never read. Tragedy and Hope by Carol Quigley, which is the blueprint for all this stuff. So you wouldn't understand hegemony or the global empire or the universal empire, which is what the panel for the New American Century is all about. Becoming a global hegemon so you can roam free. They won't even reference where they developed their theories from because they don't want you to know. They don't want you to know about this stuff. I uncovered because I've done the work. Now you guys come on to my panel and challenge me about bullshit that we actually squashed 15 years ago. We squashed it 15 years ago because it didn't make freaking sense. It didn't make sense then. It didn't make sense now. The United States, after blowing up Iraq, could have routed that pipeline any place it wanted. Could have routed it through Turkey, through Iraq. It cost a little bit more money, but it's a hell of a lot less expensive than $6 trillion they're spending blowing up countries. And France and Great Britain and Germany, Europe is wanting to get off the dollar system anyway, especially after 2008, which is something you haven't considered. Why is France and Britain helping to bomb Syria? There's other things at work here, rather than the petrodollar, which France never liked in the first place. So France will be the last people trying to help the United States hold on to the petrodollar, but you wouldn't know that because you didn't read enough. If you really know why the U.S. went off the gold system, then you would know that France has no wish to help the United States and its dollar hold power. In fact, China probably has more interest in the dollar than France does. But that's a tale for another day. And that you're not probably going to get for free, because I'm tired of putting this stuff up for free and you guys coming over there and shitting all over my videos. So if I'm going to get shitted on, at least I'm going to get paid for it. So as far as this discussion, as far as Syria is concerned, I am not going to bring it back up in here or in Hangout. That's going to be paid for. Because you guys do not, since I don't charge for it and it doesn't cost you out of your pocket, you guys come here and you shit all over it. But if you have to come and pay for it to listen to it, you're actually going to have to read the books and do the doggone homework. But this is probably where the master class, probably starting next month, that I'm actually going to do, because I'm actually getting tired of repeating myself. You guys come up with the same old tired theories that have been disproven. Syria was never seriously part of the package. Now, the Israelis wanted Syria gone. Israeli wanted a piece of Syria because that's what they wanted, but it was never part of the package. There's a reason that Iraq and Iran and Afghanistan were targeted, and Pakistan. Now, why would you target Afghanistan and Pakistan if Syria was in the mix? You could have targeted them directly. The Israelis would have helped you. You had already been there before. The Israelis would have helped you. Do your homework. I found these in 5 minutes. Not even 5 minutes, like 3 minutes. You actually wanted to go dig up something that supported your theory without back checking it against something else. I always say, if you're going to use something, at least see what the other side is saying. Not what you think. See what the other side is saying. Google is your friend. You don't have to stick to one side or the other. You can mix various sources. If you're going to come at me with this cockamamie theory about the petrodollar, at least come at me with something that's more credible. At least understand the system, which you don't understand the system. You don't understand how the system works. You don't understand how the global architecture works. Because every time I ask you about something, you have no clue. You have no answer. Everybody focuses on the petro-yuan, but nobody focuses on the SDRs. Nobody understands what the SDR is, especially Drawing Rights, because you haven't read the goddamn book where he tells you what it is. That whole book explains everything you need to know about the dollar system that we're under right now and why we're at where we're at. It's not that hard to understand. He laid it out. In fact, he laid it out so well, they wanted to kill the book. In simple terms where you can understand it. Anyway, with that, I'm going to close this one out. This last free one for you, Ulysses. Live long and prosper. This is BGS out.